I stood frozen in the conference room, while 20 pairs of eyes burned holes through my skin. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the long table where my career was being executed. George Watts, my boss for the past 3 years, slid a thick report across the polished surface with deliberate slowness. His voice carried that practiced tone of disappointment mixed with authority. "You cost us the Morrison account, Hillary." The words hit like physical blows. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain what really happened, but he was already talking over me. His lies were smooth and rehearsed, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd planned this performance carefully. He referenced client emails I'd never seen, mistakes he claimed I'd made, deadlines he said I'd missed. My body felt hot, shame and disbelief fighting for space in my chest. The silence after his speech was deafening. No one defended me, not even Daniel from accounting, who I'd considered a work friend. George's mouth curved into the smallest smirk, visible only to me. He was proud of this moment. The scene froze in my mind like a photograph. My name is Hillary Jones, and I didn't fail that campaign. I'm 34 years old, and until that moment in the conference room, I'd been the senior project coordinator at Apex Marketing Solutions, a mid-sized firm in downtown Seattle. For 6 years, I'd been the invisible glue holding our department together. I was the one who fixed everyone's mistakes at 3 a.m, who translated executive demands into workable strategies, who smoothed over client complaints before they became crises. I believed in fairness, in hard work paying off, in the idea that competence would eventually be recognized. George Watts had been my boss and mentor, or so I'd thought when he first hired me. He was charismatic, successful, respected throughout the company. When he'd called me his right hand, I'd felt proud. When he'd praised my work ethic, I'd worked even harder. I'd been so focused on proving myself worthy that I'd missed all the warning signs. I'd missed seeing that he was sharpening a knife behind my back. George ruled our floor like a king holding court. He was 42, always impeccably dressed in expensive suits that whispered success. His office had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Puget Sound, a corner space that announced his importance. Everyone laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, rushed to fulfill his requests even when they were unreasonable. His cologne, something woody and expensive, always arrived a few seconds before he did, giving people time to straighten their postures and paste on attentive expressions. He had this way of making you feel special when he focused his attention on you, like you were the only person in the building who truly understood his vision. During my first year, he'd taken me to client lunches and asked my opinion on strategies. He'd told other executives that I was invaluable, that he couldn't run the department without me. I'd believed him. I'd thought we were building something together, that my loyalty and competence were investments in a shared future. Looking back, I could see how carefully he'd groomed my dependence on his approval. The campaign idea that had gotten George promoted to senior director 18 months ago? Mine. I developed the entire concept during a weekend brainstorming session he'd requested, filling 3 notebooks with strategies for reaching younger demographics through authentic storytelling rather than traditional advertising. On Monday morning, George had asked to see my notes, promising we'd present the concept together to the executive team. Instead, he'd walked into that boardroom alone with my ideas repackaged in his confident delivery. The presentation had been brilliant because the strategy was solid. The executives had approved a massive budget, and George had been promoted within the month. He'd thanked me afterward in his office, one hand on my shoulder in a gesture that felt paternal. "You're the wind beneath my wings, Hillary. I couldn't do this without you." I'd laughed, feeling proud that I'd contributed to his success. I'd told myself that rising tides lifted all boats, that his promotion would eventually benefit me too. That was the first crack in my blind trust, though I'd refused to acknowledge it then. Tyler from accounting had warned me 6 months before everything fell apart. We'd been having coffee in the break room when George had walked past, and Tyler had watched him go with an expression I couldn't read. "Be careful with George," he'd said quietly. "He only keeps people around until he can climb over them." I defended George immediately, almost angry at the suggestion. I'd listed all the ways George had supported my career, all the opportunities he'd given me. Tyler had just shrugged and changed the subject, but something in his eyes had said he'd seen this pattern before. I'd dismissed the warning completely. I hadn't wanted to believe that the person I admired, whose respect I'd worked so hard to earn, was capable of calculated betrayal. It was easier to think Tyler was bitter or jealous than to examine the uncomfortable possibility that I'd misjudged everything. That conversation haunted me later, when I finally understood what Tyler had tried to tell me. Some people collect loyalty like weapons, storing it until they need to sacrifice someone to protect themselves. The setup had been gradual and methodical. About 4 months before the conference room ambush, George had started asking me to send him drafts of presentations and reports before they were finished. "I want to see your thought process," he'd explained. "Understanding how you work helps me guide the team better." I'd sent him everything he requested: rough concepts, half-formed strategies, preliminary data analysis. He'd make small changes and forward the documents to the executive team under his name, always with professional formatting that made them look polished and complete. When mistakes inevitably appeared in those unfinished drafts, George would forward them back to me with messages that seemed supportive but built a paper trail of my supposed errors. "Quality control is crucial, Hillary. You need to be more careful before sharing work." I'd apologized and promised to do better, not realizing he was constructing an alibi. Every draft I'd sent him became evidence of my incompetence in a narrative he was carefully crafting. By the time he was ready to sacrifice me, he had months of documentation showing a pattern of my mistakes and his patient corrections. The night everything crystallized had been a Friday in late October. The office was empty, except for me finishing reports when George had burst through the door at 8 p.m., his usual composure replaced by panic. "The Morrison presentation is missing critical data," he'd said, genuine fear in his voice. "We present Monday morning, and we're not ready." We'd spent 12 hours straight rebuilding the presentation, me pulling information from multiple databases while George formatted slides and rehearsed delivery. By dawn Saturday, we had something solid. George had looked at me across the conference table, exhaustion making him seem almost human. "You saved this project, Hillary. I won't forget this." I'd driven home feeling proud despite my exhaustion, believing I'd proven my value once again. Monday morning, George had stood in front of the executive team and told them I'd sent corrupted files that had nearly cost us the client. He'd explained how he'd worked all weekend to fix my mistakes. Every hour I'd spent saving that presentation became evidence of my failure. The betrayal was already complete. I just didn't know it yet. The scene in the conference room, the one from the opening, was what George called a quarterly performance review. But it wasn't a review. It was a public execution designed to destroy my credibility before I could defend myself. He'd invited the entire department, ostensibly so everyone could learn from my mistakes. In reality, he needed witnesses to my humiliation, people who would spread the story of my failure throughout the company. George had presented his case with the precision of a prosecutor. Altered emails, fabricated complaints, documentation that looked damning without context. When he'd finished, he'd looked at me with false sympathy. "Do you have anything to say, Hillary?" My voice had cracked when I'd responded. "You know that's not true." His expression had shifted to concerned disappointment, the look of a patient mentor dealing with a difficult employee. "Then prove it. Show us evidence that contradicts what I've presented." But I'd had nothing prepared. No defense, no counter-evidence, no witnesses to support my version of events. He'd caught me completely off guard, and my shock had looked like guilt. The meeting had ended with my demotion from senior coordinator to junior associate, a pay cut, and the unspoken understanding that I should probably resign. The silence afterward was suffocating. People avoided eye contact when I walked through the office, conversations stopping awkwardly when I entered break rooms. George had made sure to tell several key people that he was worried about me, that the stress of the job might have affected my stability. The rumor spread that I was having a breakdown, that my mistakes were symptoms of deeper problems. Colleagues I'd worked with for years suddenly treated me like I was fragile, or potentially volatile. I'd stopped trying to defend myself after the first few attempts went nowhere. Who would believe me against George's carefully constructed narrative? I couldn't sleep, lying awake, replaying every interaction and wondering what I'd missed. I cried in my car during lunch breaks, gripping the steering wheel and trying to understand how everything had fallen apart so completely. But something shifted during those dark weeks of isolation. I stopped focusing inward on my pain and started observing outward. I began listening to the office dynamics I'd been too busy to notice before, watching how George interacted with others, paying attention to who seemed uncomfortable around him. I realized George's empire was built on other people's silence. He surrounded himself with people who were either too ambitious to question him or too afraid to speak up. His power came from controlling narratives, from being the first to define situations before anyone else could form their own interpretation. But empires built on silence are inherently unstable, because silence requires constant maintenance. I started documenting everything with methodical precision. Every email George sent me, I saved to a personal cloud account with timestamps. Every conversation, I followed up with written summaries sent to my personal email. Every project, I kept detailed records of my contributions, separate from company systems. I wasn't planning revenge yet. I was simply refusing to let him erase me completely. I was creating proof that I existed, that my work mattered, that his version of reality wasn't the only truth. The act of documentation gave me something I'd lost, a sense of control, however small. I couldn't fix what had already happened, but I could ensure the future told a more complete story. George's weakness revealed itself through a junior associate named Kayla Chen. She was 26, brilliant, and hungry to prove herself. Everything I'd been when I'd started. She'd impressed a major client with an innovative social media strategy, and for a brief moment, she'd been the center of positive attention. George couldn't tolerate it. During the next team meeting, he'd presented Kayla's strategy as something he'd developed, minimizing her contribution to execution details. But I'd quietly helped Kayla document her original pitch, her emails, her meeting notes. When the client had specifically asked to work with Kayla again, she'd had proof of her authorship. George had been forced to acknowledge her contribution publicly, though he'd done it through gritted teeth. Later that week, when Kayla had made a minor formatting error on a different project, George had exploded at her in front of the entire team. The outburst had been disproportionate and cruel, revealing something people hadn't seen before: his need for control overriding his usual polished facade. People had shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. The whispers started after that meeting. Maybe George wasn't the mentor everyone thought he was. The promotion announcement came in January. George had been selected for Vice President of Marketing, a position that would give him oversight of multiple departments and a seat in executive meetings. He'd given a speech at the company-wide meeting about leadership, integrity, and building strong teams through trust and accountability. His words had been inspiring, his delivery confident, his image perfectly crafted. I'd clapped along with everyone else, my hands coming together mechanically, while my mind worked through calculations. This promotion meant George would be stretched thinner, managing more people and larger projects. It meant he'd rely even more heavily on taking credit for others' work because he wouldn't have time to develop original strategies. It meant his careful control over narratives would become harder to maintain. I'd smiled while I'd applauded, and for the first time since the conference room ambush, I'd felt something other than shame or anger. I'd felt patience. I wasn't going to attack George's empire. I was going to let him destroy it himself, while I quietly removed the foundations he didn't know he was standing on. I started helping people, quietly, without asking for credit or recognition. When Daniel from accounting struggled with a presentation for senior management, I'd spent an evening rewriting it to tell a clearer story. When the new intern had nearly gotten fired for a database error, I'd fixed the problem and showed her how to prevent it in the future. When George's assistant had been drowning in scheduling conflicts, I'd created a system that solved her organizational chaos. I never announced these interventions. I never positioned myself as anyone's savior. I simply fixed problems and moved on. But people noticed that I never bragged, never demanded recognition, never used my help as leverage. They started coming to me with questions instead of going to George. They'd stop by my desk asking for advice on projects, for feedback on strategies, for help navigating office politics. I'd become valuable in a way George couldn't control or claim, through genuine relationships rather than hierarchical authority. The shift was subtle but real. George was the official leader, but I was becoming the person people actually trusted and relied on. George's arrogance grew in proportion to his new responsibilities. He started missing deadlines, assuming someone on his team would cover for him like I always had. But I'd stopped fixing his mistakes. When he'd forgotten to review a client proposal before a deadline, I'd let it go out with the typos and formatting errors intact. When he double-booked important meetings, I'd stopped rearranging schedules to accommodate him. When his presentations lacked the detailed research that had always appeared magically because I'd added it, they'd gone forward incomplete. The first few times, George had blamed interns or junior associates for the oversights. He'd been harsh in his criticism, firing off angry emails about attention to detail and professional standards. 2 interns had quit within a month, citing hostile work environment. HR had started documenting the complaints. George had seemed oblivious to the pattern forming around him, too focused on his new vice president responsibilities to notice that the infrastructure supporting his success was crumbling. His mistakes were breathing now, visible to anyone paying attention. And people were starting to pay attention. The private apology came on a Thursday evening. I'd been working late when George had appeared at my desk, his usual confidence replaced by something that almost looked like vulnerability. The office was empty, fluorescent lights humming above us. "Hillary," he'd said, leaning against my cubicle wall with studied casualness. "I know I've been hard on you lately, maybe too hard." He'd paused, waiting for me to respond, to make it easier for him. I'd stayed silent. "The truth is," he'd continued, "I push you because you're the only one I can really count on. You're capable of more than you realize." His voice had carried that warmth I'd once craved, the tone that made you feel special and chosen. "I need you to step up again. I know you've got it in you." I'd looked at him for a long moment, seeing the calculation behind the apparent vulnerability. He'd needed something, my continued silence, my ongoing support, my willingness to keep making him look good. I'd smiled. "I know." Those 2 words had been my last conscious lie to him. I'd let him think I was back under his influence, that his charm had worked again. But I'd already decided I was done being the person who made his success possible. The board meeting happened in March. George had been scheduled to present quarterly results to the executive board, a high-stakes presentation that would determine budget allocations for the next fiscal year. I'd watched from the back of the room as he'd displayed analytics showing impressive growth across all our campaigns. The numbers had looked good, really good. Too good, actually, for someone who'd been making increasingly visible mistakes. The executives had praised his department's performance, nodding along as George had taken credit for strategies I knew had come from Kayla, Daniel, and 3 other team members whose names he'd never mentioned. He'd basked in their approval, answering questions with confidence that suggested he'd personally developed every initiative he was presenting. But I'd noticed something others had missed. The data he was presenting didn't match the raw numbers I'd seen in our internal systems. Small discrepancies, easy to overlook, but definitely there. George had manipulated the analytics to make results look better than they were. I'd sat quietly, taking notes, saying nothing. I'd known what was coming, even if he didn't. The client email arrived 2 days after the board meeting. I'd been at my desk when I'd heard George's office door slam open. His usually controlled voice had been sharp with panic as he'd called an emergency team meeting. We'd gathered in the conference room where he'd destroyed my reputation months earlier. George had stood at the head of the table, his face slightly red. "The Morrison account is threatening to pull their contract," he'd announced. "They're claiming the campaign results we reported don't match their internal tracking." Someone had asked how that was possible. George's eyes had scanned the room, looking for someone to blame. Who had access to the analytics data? His gaze had landed on several people before settling on me. I'd met his eyes steadily, something I'd been too intimidated to do before. "You did," I'd said clearly. "You pulled the final reports yourself for the board presentation." For the first time since I'd known him, George had looked rattled. The confidence that usually surrounded him like armor had cracked, just slightly, but enough for everyone in that room to notice. George started making mistakes publicly after that meeting. The careful control he'd always maintained over his image began slipping in ways he couldn't hide. He'd snapped at his assistant in the middle of the open office, loud enough for everyone to hear. He'd contradicted himself in meetings, giving different instructions about the same project on consecutive days. He'd missed 2 major deadlines in a single week, sending incomplete work to clients who'd expected the polished professionalism our firm was known for. HR had started documenting his behavior after the assistant had filed a formal complaint about workplace hostility. The executives who'd praised him at the board meeting were now receiving client complaints that mentioned him by name. George had been scrambling to contain the damage, working longer hours and growing more frantic in his attempts to maintain control. What he hadn't realized was that I'd stopped covering his tracks. For 3 years, I'd been in the invisible safety net, catching his mistakes before they became public. I'd been the one smoothing over his oversights, fixing his errors, managing the details he'd been too important to handle. Without that protection, his actual competence was being revealed. And it wasn't impressive. The COO's office was on the executive floor, behind a heavy wooden door that announced importance. When Victoria Hayes's assistant had called asking me to come up for a meeting, my stomach had dropped. I'd ridden the elevator wondering if George had convinced them to fire me, if this was the final move in his campaign to erase me from the company. Victoria had been in her mid-50s, sharp-eyed and direct in a way that didn't waste time on pleasantries. She gestured for me to sit across from her massive desk. "I've been hearing things," she'd said without preamble. "Concerns about George's department, inconsistencies in reported results, complaints from team members." She'd paused, studying me. "What's really going on?" I could have deflected, could have protected George one more time, could have claimed ignorance. Instead, I'd opened my laptop and shown her everything I'd been documenting. Emails with timestamps showing George's instructions to manipulate data. Project files demonstrating whose work had been presented under his name. Records of his pattern of blaming subordinates for his mistakes. I hadn't editorialized or made accusations. I'd simply presented facts, dates, documents, evidence. Victoria had reviewed everything in silence, her expression unreadable. Finally, she'd looked up. "We'll handle this. Thank you for bringing this to my attention." George seemed calmer over the next 2 weeks, unnaturally calm, like someone who thought they'd dodged a bullet. He'd returned to his confident posture, strutting through the office with his old swagger restored. He'd probably convinced himself that the Morrison situation was contained, that his position was secure, that his charm had worked its magic one more time. I'd watched him from my desk, observing the false security settling over him like a blanket. He'd stopped by my cubicle once, casual and friendly, asking how I was doing with that warmth he turned on and off like a switch. I'd smiled and said I was fine, everything was fine. He'd never suspected that an audit team was being assembled behind closed doors. Accountants and HR specialists reviewing every project he'd touched in the past 2 years. He'd never imagined that the COO had taken my documentation seriously enough to launch a formal investigation. The calm before the storm looked like victory from his perspective. From mine, it looked like the last few seconds before everything collapsed. The audit meeting was scheduled for a Monday morning. George had been told it was a routine review of department performance, nothing unusual or concerning. He'd walked into the conference room relaxed, maybe even looking forward to another opportunity to present impressive results. Then he'd seen the audit team arranged along one side of the table, 2 accountants, an HR director, and Victoria Hayes herself. The atmosphere had shifted immediately from routine to serious. The lead auditor had presented findings methodically, walking through discrepancies in reported campaign results, falsified analytics data, and patterns of credit theft spanning 18 months. George's face had changed colors as each piece of evidence was presented. He'd tried to explain, his voice taking on that smooth, persuasive quality he used to control narratives. But every explanation had been countered with documentation that contradicted his version of events. Victoria had finally turned to me, sitting quietly at the opposite end of the table. "Hillary, would you walk us through your involvement in these projects?" I'd spoken clearly, calmly, presenting facts without emotion. Everything I'd said had been verifiable through the documents spread across the table. George's face had drained of color as he'd realized what was happening. Security had escorted George from the building that same afternoon. I'd watched from my desk as he'd walked past carrying a small box of personal items, 2 security guards flanking him professionally but firmly. He'd tried to catch my eye, maybe looking for some reaction, anger, satisfaction, pity. I'd kept my expression neutral, refusing to give him anything. The office had gone quiet as people had watched the procession, understanding finally settling over colleagues who'd witnessed my humiliation months earlier. They were seeing George for who he really was, stripped of the charm and confidence that had hidden his manipulation. After he disappeared into the elevator, conversations had resumed in hushed tones. I'd heard my name mentioned several times, always with a different inflection than before. Respect replacing pity, understanding replacing judgment. But I hadn't felt triumphant. I'd felt relieved, like I'd been holding my breath underwater for months and could finally surface. The vindication I'd imagined would feel sweet tasted more like exhausted peace. I'd proven the truth. But the cost had been high, and the process had been grinding. Victoria's assistant had called me up to the executive floor exactly 1 week after George's removal. I'd assumed it was a final debriefing, maybe a thank you for cooperating with the investigation, possibly even a conversation about whether I wanted to stay with the company after everything that had happened. I'd prepared myself for professional pleasantries and a graceful exit strategy. Victoria had been standing by her window, overlooking the city, when I'd entered. She'd turned, gesturing for me to sit. "We need someone to lead the marketing department," she'd said without preamble. "Someone steady who can rebuild trust and restore integrity." I'd nodded, assuming she was asking for recommendations. Then she'd slid a contract folder across her desk toward me. "The board wants you to consider taking the director position." I'd stared at the folder, not quite processing her words. Director. George's old title. The position that had seemed impossibly far above me just months ago. "This isn't about feeling sorry for what happened to you," Victoria had continued. "It's recognition. You've been effectively running that department for years. Now we're asking you to do it officially." My first day as director felt surreal. The office was the same one George had occupied. Floor-to-ceiling windows, view of the sound, mahogany furniture that smelled like furniture polish and authority. His belongings were gone, replaced by empty surfaces waiting for me to claim the space. My nameplate gleamed on the door, letters spelling out my identity in permanent metal. I'd stood alone in that office for several minutes before my first meeting, trying to reconcile this reality with the woman who'd been publicly humiliated in a conference room 8 months earlier. The same colleagues who'd avoided eye contact after my demotion now looked at me with cautious respect, waiting to see what kind of leader I'd become. I wouldn't rule through fear or manipulation. I wouldn't steal credit or build my success on other people's silence. I would lead the way I'd wished someone had led me, with integrity, recognition, and genuine investment in others' growth. I touched the nameplate gently, whispering to myself, "Scapegoats don't stay silent forever." The words felt like a promise, like a boundary, like a truth I'd paid too much to learn. I recorded a final video message for the department's internal channel, wanting to set the tone for this new chapter. I spoke directly to the camera, my voice steady and clear. I learned something important over these past months. I thought revenge would feel loud, like a dramatic confrontation or a public vindication. But it doesn't. It feels quiet, like peace settling into places that used to hurt. I paused, organizing my thoughts. George lost everything because he couldn't see beyond his own ambition and pride. He built success by taking from others, and eventually, there was nothing left to take. I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. I just stopped helping him hide his inadequacy. The recording felt cathartic, giving voice to lessons that had cost me sleep and dignity and months of self-doubt. I didn't take this position out of spite or revenge. I took it because I earned it. Because I was already doing this work without the recognition. Because the best way to overcome being used is to prove you were never replaceable to begin with. I ended the message with one final thought. Know your worth. Document your contributions. Trust your instincts. They can only use you if you let them. And remember, thrones aren't taken by force. They're earned by people who were building kingdoms while others were just playing games. The day the scapegoat took the throne.